Samuel didn't ask for his name. He just glanced at the calloused hands resting on the gate, then looked into the gray-blue eyes, as still as a lake before a storm. In these parts, a man's hands told his story better than any introduction. And this stranger's hands spoke of hard work, long years on the road, and a steady reliability. "Need someone to fix fences and look after the cattle," Samuel said, his voice as hoarse as shifting gravel. "The pay isn't much. Just room and board." "That's enough," the man replied, his voice low and seldom used. His name was Elias. A girl with a chestnut brown braid stood behind the old man, her eyes wide and clear but filled with a caution that was beyond her 16 years. She was Lena, and she had learned that strangers who came here rarely stayed long. Elias's first days passed in silence. He worked from before sunrise until after dusk. He herded the thin cattle across the sun-scorched pastures, mended the rotten sections of fence with old barbed wire, and fixed the water pump that constantly whined like a mournful complaint. He worked diligently, without questions or complaints. His silence seemed to match the tense quiet of the ranch itself. He quickly learned to read the unspoken signs. The red-bordered letters that Samuel would quickly hide. The phone calls that Lena would answer in a whisper before hanging up, her shoulders slumped. And most of all, the presence of the sleek sedan that would occasionally drive slowly past the gate, out of place in the dusty landscape, like a vulture circling, waiting. At the western edge of the property stood a giant, ancient cottonwood tree. Its trunk was gnarled and wide enough for two people to encircle, its weathered branches reaching for the sky like tired arms. It stood there, a silent witness to time, to the lives that had come and gone, and to the desperation that was quietly taking root in this land. One afternoon, while replacing a fence post near the tree, Elias saw Lena sitting in its shade, her arms wrapped around her knees. He didn't approach, just kept to his work. But he could hear her muffled sobs, a sound as fragile as a butterfly in the wind. He knew that the wind and dust in this valley were not just eroding the land, they were eroding hope. And he could feel, though he didn't want to, that the real storm had not yet begun. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a crack in the dry earth, but in the fragile peace of the ranch. Caldwell arrived unannounced. He carried a leather briefcase and a condescending smile. "Mr. Miller," Caldwell said to Samuel, his voice smooth but cold. "I'm here to make a final offer. AgriCorp is prepared to buy your entire property for a fair price. Enough for you and your granddaughter to have a fresh start somewhere else." Samuel stood tall, his thin shoulders trying to appear strong. Instead of saying he was angry, he simply clenched his weathered hands into fists, his knuckles turning white. His jaw was set, showing the hard lines of defiance. "This land is not for sale," he said, his voice tight. "It's home." Caldwell smirked. "Sir, home is a relative term. The bank doesn't see it that way. According to their files, this is collateral on the verge of foreclosure. Our offer is an act of mercy, not a negotiation." The conversation was short but heavy. It had no pleasantries, only a direct clash of wills, one of deep-rooted resilience, the other of cold, corporate ruthlessness. From the house, Lena watched through the window, her hands clasped together. Elias was further up a hill, but he saw it all. He saw Samuel's small but unyielding figure and Caldwell's dismissive wave as he drove away. After that day, strange things began to happen. One night, the northern fence, which Elias had just repaired, was deliberately cut, sending the panicked cattle onto the highway. A few days later, the ranch's only water pump was sabotaged with sand. Elias had to stay up for 2 nights, taking it apart to clean every single piece. These were psychological blows, cowardly acts of sabotage designed to wear down the old man's will. Samuel grew quieter, his dinners marked only by the sound of silverware on plates. Lena tried to act cheerful, but her smile couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. Elias witnessed it all. He said nothing, simply repairing what was broken. In his silence, there was a deep observation. He saw in Samuel the ghost of his own father, another farmer who had fought his whole life to keep his land, only to lose to drought and debt. The external battle Samuel was fighting against AgriCorp had accidentally touched the internal war inside Elias himself. The conflict between running away and standing his ground. One evening, Lena brought him a glass of lemonade as he sat on the porch. She sat on the steps nearby. "Why are you staying?" she asked, her voice clear. The other hired hands all left. Elias looked out into the night. "Maybe because I'm done running," he said, his voice hoarse. "And maybe because your grandfather reminds me of someone." Under the ancient cottonwood tree, where the cracks of hardship were growing wider, a seed of trust had begun to sprout. The breaking point finally came. It was a Friday morning when the mailman delivered the letter Samuel had been dreading most. The final notice of foreclosure. They had 30 days to vacate. After reading it, Samuel swayed. He grabbed the edge of a table, his face went pale, and he slowly sank into his old armchair. A sharp pain shot through his chest. Lena screamed in panic. Elias, hearing the cry from the barn, rushed inside. The image of Samuel, pale and in pain, and Lena, weeping beside him, became a powerful catalyst. In that moment, Elias was no longer just a hired hand. The invisible wall he had built around himself for years crumbled. He helped Samuel take his medicine and then drove him in his pickup truck to the clinic in the nearest town. The doctor said it was a mild heart attack, brought on by extreme stress. Samuel needed to rest, to avoid any and all pressure. But how can you rest when your home is about to be taken away? On the drive back, Samuel said nothing, only staring out the window at the fields he had worked his entire life. The silence in the truck was heavier than the rumbling engine. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He walked outside and stood under the giant cottonwood tree. Moonlight filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the ground. He saw Lena there, her back against the gnarled trunk as if seeking its protection. He sat down near her, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to intrude. "Your grandfather will be okay," he said softly. "But we'll lose everything?" Lena sobbed. "This tree. This house. Everything. Why are they so cruel?" This was the climax of his internal conflict. Samuel's collapse had forced him to face the choice he had avoided his whole life. To remain a cowardly bystander or to stand up and fight for something, even with the risk of failure. He reached out and placed his hand not on her, but on the rough bark of the tree beside them. "Lena," he said, his voice now filled with a firm resolve. "I can't promise that we'll win. I can't promise it will be easy." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "But I promise you this. They won't take this land without a fight. I will not let you and your grandfather face this alone." That promise, made under the ancient cottonwood, was stronger than any contract. The tree, once a symbol of the past, now became a symbol of an oath, of hope for the future. A promise is a seed. For it to grow, It needs action. Elias knew that he and an ailing old man couldn't fight AgriCorp alone. Their only strength lay in the community, a community that had been fractured by fear and mistrust. Elias began a new journey, not to run away, but to connect. He drove to every farm in the valley. He knocked on doors he had never approached before. He spoke to farmers with faces as weathered as Samuel's. He didn't make grand speeches. He told Samuel's story. He showed them the foreclosure notice. He spoke of the sabotaged water pump and the scattered cattle. He spoke of an old man about to lose everything he had ever built. At first, there was skepticism. "That's the miller's problem, not ours," one said. "Fight AgriCorp? You're crazy. They'll crush us," said another. Many doors were shut in his face. But Elias persisted. He didn't argue. He would just nod and say, "Today, it's Samuel. Tomorrow, it could be any of us." That simple, stark sentence struck at their deepest fears. Slowly, a few began to listen. They were the ones who had also received fair offers from Caldwell, who had also faced accidental problems on their land. The rebellion didn't start with a bang, but with whispered conversations in barns and quiet nods in the town's only cafe. And Elias, the unknown drifter, became the glue that held them together. The last day of the 30-day notice arrived. That morning, the sheriff's car and Caldwell's sleek sedan drove down the road to the Miller Ranch. They had come to execute the eviction. But as they approached the gate, they were forced to stop. It wasn't an angry mob. It was a silent wall. A quiet storm. 15 pickup trucks, old and rusted, had formed an impassable barrier. The farmers stood there, their faces resolute. They carried no weapons. Their presence alone was their most powerful weapon. Caldwell got out of his car, his usual smug smile gone, replaced by fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is obstruction of justice," he yelled. No one answered. The sheriff, a tired middle-aged man who knew all of these people, stepped forward. "Folks, please, disperse. Don't make this worse," he pleaded. It was then that Elias spoke, his voice calm but carrying through the stillness. "We're not looking for trouble, Sheriff. We're just here to see that our neighbor is treated fairly. We're not moving until AgriCorp agrees to negotiate in good faith, not with threats and sabotage." This was the climax of the action. The showdown played out in silence and gazes. The farmers' strength was not in muscle, but in their unity. They had turned their individual weakness into a collective power. Caldwell was stunned. He could deal with one old man, but he couldn't deal with an entire valley. The standoff lasted for nearly an hour. Finally, with no other choice, Caldwell got back in his car and drove away in a cloud of dust. As the sedan disappeared, the farmers didn't cheer. They just looked at one another, and for the first time in months, relieved smiles appeared on their faces. They knew this wasn't the final victory, but it was an important one. They had found their voice again. The silent blockade created a small but important ripple. A local newspaper reporter wrote a story about the rebellion of the pickup trucks. The tale of small farmers daring to stand up to a giant corporation drew public attention. AgriCorp, fearing a public relations disaster, was forced to retreat. They paused the foreclosure and agreed to restructure the loans. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The financial and legal battle still lay ahead. But the most important thing had changed. No one had to fight alone anymore. Elias stayed on at the ranch. He was no longer just a hired hand, nor was he quite family. He was a part of this place, like the ancient cottonwood tree, quiet and steadfast. He had found what he thought he had lost forever. A place to belong, and a reason to stand and fight. He realized that home isn't a place you're from. It's the people you are willing to stand up for. One afternoon, Samuel handed Elias an old, folded document. It was the original deed to the land. "My father used to say," Samuel said, his voice thoughtful, "that we don't really own the land. We're just its caretakers for the next generation. You helped me keep it for Lena. I don't know how to thank you." Elias just nodded. He understood. Our story ends on an autumn day. The leaves of the giant cottonwood had turned a brilliant gold, shimmering in the sun. The small community was gathered beneath its branches for a potluck. There was laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. He saw Lena laughing with her friends, her face free from worry. He saw Samuel talking cheerfully with his neighbors. Lena saw him and ran over, holding a blue ribbon. Without a word, she stood on her toes and tied it to a low branch, next to the faded, weathered ribbons from generations past. It was a simple gesture, a silent, "Thank you." The ancient cottonwood, once a symbol of history and endurance, now wore a new symbol. One of unity, of a promise kept, and of a future reclaimed. The autumn wind still blew through the valley, but next season, the wind would be different. It would no longer carry the taste of tears and dust, but the sound of laughter and hope. It would carry the story of ordinary people who, by standing together, did something extraordinary. And it reminds us that sometimes, the greatest courage isn't facing down a raging bull, but daring to stand still when everyone else runs away. That our deepest roots are found not in the soil, but in the hearts of those we protect. Thank you for listening. Have a peaceful night.